Imagine this. You're married, living the dream life, the love of your life by your side, and then, suddenly a shocking revelation turns everything upside down. I married my cousin without knowing it. That's right. 4 years I lived in a wonderful relationship, thinking I was with the right person. But what I didn't know was that my marriage story was about to be rewritten with a truth so mind-blowing, I could barely believe it. And I'm not talking about a small mistake or just any secret, but something that would change everything. The hidden truth my own family had kept from me. Have you ever imagined living a lie without even knowing it? Thinking you're on the right path, only to find out you've been deceived by everyone around you. Family has its own secrets, and sometimes what you think is the perfect life is actually supported by something much darker. But what do you do when you discover that the person you married, someone you love deeply, is actually your cousin? Changes everything. What do you do with the pain of betrayal, the family scandal, and the confusion about your own identity? I had to face those questions, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath of a shocking revelation that turned my world upside down. Stay with me because today I'm sharing with you the story of how all of this unfolded and the impact it had on my life. Don't forget to like the video, and if you've ever been in a similar situation or have thoughts about this kind of thing, drop a comment below. Let's talk about the taboos and stories we often keep hidden. I remember the first time I laid eyes on him. It felt like something straight out of a fairy tale, you know? You know those moments when everything slows down, and you just know that person is going to change your life forever. Yeah, it was exactly like that. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was this magnetic pull between us that I couldn't ignore. Every conversation we had seemed like it was meant to be, like we were two pieces of a puzzle finally coming together after years of searching for each other. Our relationship moved fast, but it felt right. We clicked in every way. We laughed at the same jokes, shared similar dreams, and our chemistry off the charts. When he proposed, I was on cloud 9. It wasn't just the diamond ring or the perfect setting. It was the promise of a life together. Our wedding day came, and it felt like the beginning of something beautiful. I was excited, hopeful, and convinced that we had it all. The perfect partner, the perfect love, the perfect future. But little did I know, everything was about to come crashing down, shattering everything I thought I knew about family, love, and identity. What happened next wasn't just a bump in the road. It was a shocking revelation that would change the course of my life forever. Imagine thinking everything is perfect, like you're living in this beautiful romantic story. And then, bam, the universe throws a curveball at you. It wasn't just a small surprise, it was a full-blown family secret uncovered, one that I never, in a million years, expected. The kind of discovery that makes you question everything about who you are and what you stand for. And that's where my story starts to get messy, real messy. You see, what I learned shattered everything I thought was true about the love I was living, the relationship we were building, and the family ties I held dear. And it all began with a simple comment, a casual remark that planted a seed of doubt. But let's get to that later. For now, let me just say this. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that I would one day find myself at the center of a family scandal, caught between a forbidden love and a hidden truth that no one wanted to face. It all started with the first red flag. And I'll tell you exactly how I ignored it, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. It was easier that way. But what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried? It wasn't until months after we got married that the first real red flag popped up, completely out of nowhere. I still remember the day it happened. Family dinner, everyone gathered around the table, and the conversation flowing casually, just like it always did. My husband, who was still my new husband at the time, was chatting with my cousin, and there was this moment where I couldn't quite place the look in my cousin's eyes. It wasn't judgment exactly, but more like recognition, like she knew something I didn't. I shrugged it off at first. It wasn't like anything was said outright, but there was this underlying tension, a slight shift in the atmosphere that I couldn't ignore. Then came the comment. It seemed innocent enough at first, just a passing remark in the middle of the conversation, but it struck me like a lightning bolt. You know, it's funny, you two really do look alike. You're both so much like. And then she trailed off, her voice suddenly dipping into awkward silence, the words unfinished. I laughed nervously, brushing it off, thinking maybe she was just making a joke about how similar we were in certain ways. But deep down, something in my gut told me that this wasn't just a random comment. Over the next few days, I kept replaying that moment in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to that comment than met the eye. But honestly, I didn't want to believe it. I loved my husband and I loved my family. I didn't want to question anything, especially not about him. So I ignored it, hoping that it was nothing more than a weird moment that didn't mean anything. But that nagging feeling didn't go away. It lingered, hanging in the back of my mind like a cloud I couldn't clear. Looking back now, I wish I had listened to that instinct, that gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. But at the time, I was too wrapped up in the excitement of our marriage, the honeymoon phase that clouded my judgment. We were building our life together, and I thought that nothing could stand in the way of our happiness. Who would ever suspect that a family secret, something so deeply hidden, could affect us this way? I pushed aside the discomfort and kept moving forward. I didn't want to question my family's dynamics, and I certainly didn't want to disrupt the life we were building. But that nagging seed of doubt kept growing. Every time I saw my cousin, I noticed that strange look in her eyes again. And it wasn't just her. Other family members started acting a little off too. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things, like glances exchanged when I mentioned my husband's name, or awkward pauses when we brought up future plans together. These weren't just random moments. They felt deliberate, like they were waiting for something. One night, I sat down with my best friend to talk about all the weirdness that had been going on. She listened patiently as I vented, pouring my heart out about the strange tension I'd been feeling. "It's probably nothing," she said, trying to reassure me. But even as she said it, I could hear the doubt in her voice. Something wasn't right and I knew it. But I couldn't let myself think too much about it. It wasn't until later, much later, that I realized what I should have done in that moment. What I should have confronted. But there's a tricky thing about love, isn't there? When you love someone, you're blinded by it. And that's exactly what happened to me. I didn't want to believe that something so huge could be hidden from me. I didn't want to accept the possibility that my family bonds might be built on deception, or that my marriage could be tainted by a hidden truth that no one wanted to reveal. It was easier to ignore those unsettling comments, easier to push aside the uncomfortable thoughts and pretend everything was fine. Of course, it wasn't long before that nagging feeling became undeniable. The truth always has a way of coming to light, and when it does, it's like a freight train. But by then it was too late. The emotional turmoil I was about to go through would shake the very foundation of everything I thought I knew. And when that truth finally unfolded, it wasn't just a shocking discovery. It was a family scandal that tore everything apart. The moment I stumbled upon the truth didn't feel like the dramatic scene you see in movies. There was no loud music, no sudden gasp or tear-filled confrontation. It was subtle, an accidental discovery that unraveled everything piece by piece, like slowly pulling at a thread that eventually pulled the entire fabric of my life apart. It started innocently enough, when I was going through some old family photos that I'd inherited from my grandmother. We were moving into a new house, and I was sorting through boxes of memories, finding pieces of the past that had been long forgotten. At the bottom of a dusty box, I found a collection of photographs and letters that piqued my curiosity. As I started flipping through them, something stood out. There were photographs of my husband from years before we had met, but there was something strangely familiar about his presence in those pictures. Almost too familiar. I squinted at the images, trying to recall where I had seen the other people in them. They looked like distant relatives, but something was off. A few names were written on the back of the photos, names I hadn't heard in ages. But one name kept showing up. His name, my husband's name, written in the same handwriting as my grandmother's. It was then that I felt a knot in my stomach. I had to do a double take. Could it be possible that my husband had known some of these people? That he had spent time with them long before we had crossed paths? But that wasn't the worst part. As I kept digging through the pile of photos, I found an old family tree, one that had been drawn out by my grandfather. It was nothing fancy, just a hand-drawn chart with the names of people who had long passed, but then I saw something that froze me in place. I followed the lines, traced the connections, and there, staring back at me, was a name I never expected to see. My husband. Took a second for it to click, and then my heart sank. It was like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just my husband, he was my cousin. The bloodlines crossed in a way that was not only shocking but also, at that moment, completely incomprehensible to me. My hands were shaking as I traced the lines connecting us, confirming what I couldn't yet bring myself to fully understand. My husband, the man I had married, the man I loved and trusted, was a cousin I had never known about. The family secret, the one that had been buried under layers of time and silence, had somehow found its way into the heart of my marriage. I sat there for what felt like hours, holding the photographs, trying to make sense of what was in front of me. It was all coming together, the subtle clues, the comments, the odd stares from relatives that I had never understood. It was like someone had been planting little seeds of doubt all along, but I had been too blinded by love, by the life we were building together, to see it. The reality of it was too much. My world, everything I had thought was solid and certain, was crumbling in front of me. I could feel my heart racing, my mind spinning. I couldn't even process the overwhelming wave of emotions that flooded over me. How had this happened? How could no one have told me? How could I have been so blind to something that seemed so obvious now? The betrayal hit me like a freight train, but not just from him. Not just from my husband. The real betrayal came from my family. The ones who had known about this connection. The ones who had kept the hidden truth from me for so long. My trust in them shattered in an instant. How could they have let this happen? How could they have allowed me to marry into something so taboo without saying a word? The family dynamics that I thought I understood, that I thought were built on loyalty and love, suddenly felt like an illusion. I didn't know who to trust anymore, not just my husband but my family too. I felt this emotional conflict deep in my chest, this identity crisis that threatened to overwhelm me. Who was I now? Who was I in this family? In this relationship? Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family bonds, had been turned upside down. And in the midst of all of this, I had to question the very foundation of our forbidden love. The genetic connection that linked us was more than just biological. It was tied to a hidden past, to family secrets that had been buried for generations. And it wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a family scandal that was too big to ignore. I couldn't help but feel like I was living in a twisted version of some drama, a story that was way beyond my control. The guilt, the shame, the confusion, I felt it all. I wondered if this was a forbidden romance I had been unknowingly living all along. Was I complicit in this deception? Had I knowingly crossed a line I should never have crossed? It was so hard to process, so hard to know what the right thing was to do in the face of such an unexpected twist. But I had to keep going. I had to make sense of what was happening. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, my body was trembling. The discovery had left me restless, unable to focus on anything else. The love I had once been so sure of, the love that had seemed so perfect and pure, now felt tainted by this truth, by this family secret that had been kept hidden for so long. I spent hours trying to find clarity, trying to make peace with everything, but all I could hear in my mind was the voice of that cousin, the one who had first planted the seed of doubt. The one who, maybe unknowingly, had set in motion the chain of events that had completely turned my life upside down. What did this mean for our marriage? What did this mean for our future? Could I ever look at him the same way again? Could we rebuild from this? But I still wasn't ready to face him. I wasn't sure I even wanted to know more. The emotional turmoil I was in, anger, betrayal, confusion, was too much for me to handle. I had to process this on my own, before I could ever confront him. But little did I know, the hardest part was yet to come. The moment I confronted him about the truth was, without a doubt, the most gut-wrenching, heart-shattering moment of my life. When I found out, I didn't know what to do. There was a part of me that wanted to ignore it, to pretend that I hadn't seen what I had seen, to keep our lives the way they were. But deep down, I knew I couldn't continue pretending. I couldn't continue living in this bubble of ignorance and blissful denial. The hidden truth had been staring me in the face, and I couldn't unsee it. I waited until we were alone, hoping the space and the quiet would give me the courage I needed to finally ask the question that had been haunting me. My heart was racing in my chest as I sat across from him at the kitchen table, my fingers tapping nervously on the surface. He was sitting there, looking at me with that same familiar smile, but there was a nervousness in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. It was like he knew something was coming, but he didn't know exactly what. I almost wished I didn't have to do it, didn't have to ask him the question that was tearing me apart. I took a deep breath, my throat tight with emotion, and finally said it. "Are we cousins?" His face went pale, his smile faded, and for the briefest moment, I could see the weight of the betrayal in his eyes. It was like he had been holding his breath this whole time, waiting for me to finally uncover the truth. The silence between us was deafening. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and I thought I might choke on my own words. It was as though the world had stopped moving around me, and everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family was slipping away, piece by piece. He didn't say anything at first, and I could feel the tension building between us. He wasn't even looking at me anymore. I could see his hands tremble slightly, like he was bracing himself for something. And then, when he finally spoke, it wasn't with the calm, reassuring voice I had always known. It was shaky, full of guilt, and just barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he said. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I didn't want to hurt you." His words hit me like a slap to the face, but they also confirmed what I had already feared. There was no turning back now. The family secret was out in the open. My world, as I knew it, had completely flipped upside down. The very man I had chosen to marry, the man I had trusted with my heart, had kept this monumental deception hidden from me. And not just from me, from everyone. It wasn't just an innocent mistake or a forgotten detail. It was something much deeper, something intentional. He had known, and he had never told me. "I never meant for this to happen," he continued, his voice cracking. "I didn't think it would matter. I thought if we were in love, it wouldn't matter. I didn't think I could lose you over something like this." The words were there, but the meaning behind them was impossible to grasp. How could he say that? How could he think that love, something so pure and sacred, could somehow erase the genetic connection that tied us together in a way I never asked for? How could he not see the family dynamics at play here? That this wasn't just a simple mistake, a taboo love story. This was much more than just an emotional connection. It was a betrayal of trust, of family, of everything we had built. I felt a storm of emotions rise up in me. Anger, heartbreak, confusion, disbelief. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to ask him how he could do this to me, to us. But instead, all I could do was sit there in stunned silence, my mind racing with a million thoughts. How could I ever look at him the same way again? How could I ever trust him after this? He reached across the table, his hand shaking as he tried to touch mine, but I pulled away instinctively. I wasn't ready for that. I couldn't even bear to be in the same room with him at that moment. I needed space, I needed time to process everything. The emotional conflict inside me was overwhelming. I loved him, but how could I love him after this? How could I rebuild the trust that had been shattered in an instant? "You don't have to forgive me," he said quietly, his eyes full of regret. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted this to ruin everything we had. But it was too late. It had already ruined everything. The discovery was out, and I couldn't go back to the way things were. My world had shifted in ways I couldn't even describe, and I didn't know how to move forward from here. How could I live with the knowledge that the man I had married, the man I had planned a future with, was my cousin? How could I look at him and see the man I loved, knowing that our relationship was based on something I didn't fully understand? The deception had gone so deep that it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me. The conversation dragged on, but my mind wasn't really there anymore. I kept thinking about the family bonds that had been broken, the trust that had been shattered, and the life we had planned together that now seemed like a distant dream. Every question I asked him, every answer he gave me, only seemed to make everything worse. I didn't know where to go from here. I didn't know what to do with this new reality that had been thrust upon me. But I knew one thing for sure: our marriage would never be the same again. The love we shared was tainted, and the forbidden romance we had built our lives on felt like a lie. As I looked at him sitting across from me, the man I had married, I couldn't help but wonder, could I ever forgive him? Could I ever move past this family scandal? Or was this the end of everything we had? The days that followed that confrontation felt like I was living in a whirlwind. One minute, I was overwhelmed by anger and disbelief, and the next, I was flooded with sadness and confusion. I had never imagined my life would take such an unexpected turn. It was like I had been living in this perfect, untouched world, and suddenly everything came crashing down around me. My emotions were all over the place, and I was struggling to reconcile two opposing truths: the love I felt for my husband, and the taboo nature of our connection. How could something so pure, something that felt so right, be wrong on such a fundamental level? How could I love him and feel betrayed by him at the same time? I couldn't make sense of it. Love is supposed to be simple, right? You meet someone, fall for them, and live happily ever after. But what happens when that love is built on a foundation of secrets? A foundation that was never meant to be uncovered. I had always believed that love could overcome anything. I believed that love was a force so powerful that it could erase mistakes, overcome obstacles, and heal wounds. But this was different. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something deeper, something embedded in our family history, in our bloodline. This wasn't just about emotions, it was about identity. As much as I loved him, the shocking revelation of our genetic connection turned everything upside down. Every moment I spent with him felt like it was tainted by this hidden truth. I couldn't shake the thought that, in some way, I was complicit in something I didn't even know was happening. How could I have ignored the signs, the hints, the odd stares from relatives? Why had no one told me the truth before? There was so much shame tied to this discovery, and I couldn't help but feel like I was somehow guilty by association. I felt trapped between the love I had for him and the emotional turmoil of knowing that our love was considered forbidden, a family scandal that could ruin both of our lives. At the same time, I couldn't just turn off my feelings. I couldn't just stop loving him because the truth was uncomfortable. After all, love isn't a switch you can flip on and off at will. The emotional conflict I was experiencing was tearing me apart. I wanted to leave, to run away from it all and never look back. But then I would remember the moments we had shared, the intimacy, the way he made me feel, and I would hesitate. Could I really walk away from the family bonds we had built, from everything that we had been to each other? The thought of heartbreak felt unbearable, like I was losing a part of myself. I spent countless hours thinking about the nature of our relationship drama, the lies, the half-truths, and the deception that had led us to this point. I thought about how I had blindly trusted him, how I had given him my heart, and how he had never once told me the truth. And I wondered, was it his fault, or was it the fault of the family that kept this secret from me? What had I done to deserve this? I didn't know who I was anymore. Was I just a woman in love with her cousin, or was I a victim of a forbidden romance I had unknowingly entered into? It felt like I was living a nightmare, but every time I tried to wake up, I realized that this was my reality now. But as time went on, I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about my love or my betrayal. It was about identity. It was about who I was in this relationship, in this family, and in the world. How did I fit into a society that considered our love taboo? How could I face my friends, my family, and the world knowing that I had been living a lie, that everything I thought I knew about myself was built on a hidden truth? The shame of it all was suffocating, and yet, I couldn't let go of the one thing that kept me grounded, him. For days we barely spoke. I couldn't bring myself to look at him without feeling a wave of disgust and confusion. And yet, there was this part of me that still loved him, that still wanted to be with him. How could I love him so much and yet feel so betrayed by him at the same time? It was like my heart and my mind were at war with each other, pulling me in two different directions. I finally decided to seek help. I couldn't process everything on my own. I started seeing a therapist, someone who could help me unpack the layers of emotions I was feeling. Anger, shame, guilt, confusion, and everything in between. It wasn't easy. Every session felt like a battle. I would cry, I would rage, I would try to make sense of it all, but nothing made it easier. The family dynamics were complicated. and I wasn't sure how to move forward with someone I loved but also couldn't trust. I had to learn how to navigate this emotional maze. How to accept the truth without losing myself in the process. But no matter how much I tried to talk through it, the questions kept coming back. Could I ever love him without this stain on our relationship? Could we ever rebuild trust after something so deep, so personal, had been kept from me for so long? Or had this discovery changed everything beyond repair? The love we had shared was no longer innocent. It was now clouded by the knowledge that we were family, and family, whether by blood or by choice, was a bond that couldn't be easily ignored. My identity as his wife was no longer enough to keep me grounded. I was struggling to figure out who I was, who we were, and where we could possibly go from here. The fallout from the truth was devastating, and it didn't take long for me to realize just how deep the impact was on our marriage. The trust we had built, the foundation of our relationship, was shattered. And the worst part, I didn't know how to rebuild it. How could I trust him again? How could I look at him and see the man I had once believed to be perfect, when everything I thought I knew about him had been a lie? The family ties that had once seemed so strong now felt like a web of deception, and my whole life had become an emotional battlefield. I remember the first night we tried to talk about it again. It wasn't just a casual conversation. This was the conversation we both had been avoiding, but neither of us could ignore anymore. I was numb, drained from the emotional toll of the past few days, but also desperate for answers. I needed to understand why this had happened, why he had kept such a hidden truth from me. But no matter how much I tried to understand, the answers just didn't make sense. The guilt and the shame were so overwhelming that I couldn't even look him in the eyes. Every word he spoke, every explanation he offered, felt hollow, like it didn't really matter anymore. He was my husband, my partner, the person I had promised to share my life with, and yet I couldn't escape the nagging thought that I didn't truly know him anymore. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It wasn't just about the taboo of our marriage. It was about the trust that had been broken between us, a trust that we both had worked so hard to build. I couldn't help but wonder, had he ever truly been honest with me? Had he been hiding other parts of himself, other secrets, that I would never know? I had always prided myself on our honesty, on the way we communicated so openly with each other. But now it felt like everything I had believed about us was a lie. Deception had crept into every corner of our relationship, and I didn't know how to rid myself of it. For him, things were equally difficult. He was devastated by my reaction, by the pain he had caused me. He could see it in my eyes. The distance, the coldness that had crept in since I had found out. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to make it right. But I didn't know if I wanted to be fixed. How could we go back to the way things were? How could I ever trust him again after the way he had hidden something so important from me? I felt like I was living in a fog. Our intimacy, which had once been so natural and easy, felt forced now. Every touch felt like it carried the weight of our genetic connection, and I couldn't shake the thought that our love, no matter how real it had been, was forbidden. How could I ever allow myself to be that close to him again, knowing what I knew? How could we go back to the physical closeness we once shared when the very nature of our relationship had been turned into something dirty, something wrong? And it wasn't just the physical part of our marriage that had changed. Our daily life was also deeply affected. Small things became huge triggers. We couldn't even talk about future plans without the emotional conflict rising to the surface. How could I talk about building a future with him when everything about our future now seemed so uncertain? How could I talk about having children with him when everything about our family dynamics had been shattered? The questions were endless, and the answers were elusive. We tried to act like everything was okay at times. We went through the motions of a normal married life. Shared meals, casual conversations, small gestures of affection, but it was all a facade. It wasn't real anymore. Not for me. Not for him. We were both pretending, trying to convince ourselves that we could overcome this, that we could still find a way to make it work. But deep down, I knew that something fundamental had broken between us. Could I really continue in this marriage? Could I live with this constant feeling of betrayal and heartbreak? Could I ever truly forgive him? The weight of the judgment from others made everything worse. People who didn't know the full story, who didn't understand the emotional turmoil I was going through, looked at us with suspicion. There was this uncomfortable tension whenever we were around friends or family, as if they could somehow sense the family scandal that was hanging over us. It wasn't just the judgment from strangers, it was the judgment from my own family, the people who had known about our genetic connection all along and never told me. The resentment I felt toward them was just as strong as the resentment I felt toward my husband. How could they have let this happen? How could they have stood by and let me marry into something that felt so wrong, so tainted? The emotional weight of that betrayal was nearly too much to bear, and so we both found ourselves stuck. I was stuck in this emotional limbo, caught between the love I still felt for him and the deception that had torn our marriage apart. I was stuck between the desire to make it work and the knowledge that it might never be the same again. Could we ever rebuild? Could I ever trust him again? Could we ever have a family in the way I had once dreamed about? The answers seemed just out of reach. Every day felt like a battle with myself, with him, with our past, with the family bonds that had been broken, and with the forbidden love we had shared. I didn't know how to move forward, and I didn't know if we could survive this. The moment the truth came out, it felt like a bomb had gone off in our family, and the explosion was felt far and wide. Everything changed. The family I had once known, this supportive, loving group of people I had shared so many memories with, became a fractured, broken shell of what it used to be. I didn't know where to turn, who to trust, or how to navigate this new world where everything I thought I knew about my family was now in question. Family dynamics had always been the backbone of my life, my identity. My family was the foundation that I had built everything else on. And now, that foundation had been destroyed, blown apart by the hidden truth that had been kept from me for so long. The first blow came from my parents. They were in shock, yes, but there was something else there, too. There was guilt in their eyes, the kind of guilt that comes from knowing you should have said something but didn't. The way they looked at me, it was almost as if they were apologizing without saying a word. My mother couldn't even look me in the eye when I first told her. She was too ashamed. She didn't want to admit that she had known something was wrong, that the family secret was there, lurking beneath the surface for years. But at the same time, I could see the confusion in her face. She didn't know how to explain it, how to justify what had happened. And for the first time, I wondered if my parents had been hiding something from me too. Had they known all along about our genetic connection? Had they been keeping this secret, just like my husband had? It felt like everything I thought I knew about my family bonds had been called into question. How could I ever look at my parents the same way again after this? The next blow came from my extended family. Relatives who I had known and loved for years started acting strange too. There was this undercurrent of tension in every conversation, every gathering. They didn't know what to say to me, and frankly, I didn't know what to say to them. How do you explain something like this? How do you walk into a room full of people who are now questioning the very family dynamics you've always known? How do you face them knowing that they've all been keeping this family scandal a secret from you? Some relatives distanced themselves, unsure of what to think. Others, like my aunt, tried to be supportive but only made things worse with their well-meaning yet clueless comments. "You'll get through this," she said one day, her hand on my shoulder. "This kind of thing happens sometimes. You just have to move forward." But how could I move forward? How could I pretend everything was fine when I was drowning in the weight of this revelation? She had no idea how much emotional turmoil I was going through, how hard it was to even leave the house, let alone try to move forward. No, it wasn't that simple. I wasn't ready to let go of my pain, of my betrayal. As much as I tried to explain to my family that I needed space to process this, to heal on my own, they didn't understand. They didn't realize the complexity of what I was dealing with. It wasn't just the emotional conflict between me and my husband. It was the realization that my entire world had been built on lies. That's not something you just move forward from. The deception ran so deep that every part of my identity felt like it had been questioned. Who was I now in the context of this forbidden love? Who was I now in a family that had kept such a monumental secret from me? And then there was the guilt. The guilt I felt toward my family. I had grown up trusting them, believing that our family bonds were unbreakable, that we shared everything no matter how difficult. And yet, they had kept this secret from me. They had watched me marry into a relationship that was, at its core, not only a betrayal of my trust, but a violation of the family code I had always believed in. I couldn't stop asking myself, how could they do this to me? Eventually, I had to confront some of the family members who had known the truth all along. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done. I remember sitting down with my aunt, the one person I had always considered a confidant, someone I thought I could trust with anything. I looked at her, waiting for an explanation. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, thick with emotion. Her answer was evasive, filled with apologies and excuses, but nothing that could explain the depth of the betrayal. She told me that they were trying to protect me, but in truth, all I felt was abandoned, alone, and deceived. The more I tried to understand, the more I realized that I couldn't expect to find answers from them. They had failed me. The family loyalty I had always valued had been twisted into a cover-up, a conspiracy to keep this family secret buried, no matter the cost. The shocking revelation of our genetic connection wasn't just about me and my husband. It was about a family scandal that affected everyone, and yet no one had been brave enough to tell me the truth. The trust one had once had in my family, in the people who had always been my support system, was now gone. It felt like a house of cards, crumbling down piece by piece, and I was left standing there, alone, trying to pick up the pieces. I didn't know if I would ever be able to rebuild these relationships. Could I ever look at my parents and relatives the same way again after this? Could I ever trust them again? I didn't know the answers, and frankly, I didn't know if I cared. The emotional toll it took on me was like nothing I had ever experienced before. I had to figure out how to navigate these broken relationships, how to heal from the wounds that my family had inflicted, whether intentionally or not. And as much as I wanted to blame them for everything that had happened, I knew I couldn't hold on to the anger forever. If I wanted to move forward, I had to learn to let go of the resentment and start building something new. But was I ready for that? In the aftermath of everything, the shocking revelation, the confrontation, the emotional chaos, I realized I couldn't process all of this on my own. It wasn't just about dealing with the betrayal of my husband or my family. It was about dealing with the emotional turmoil that had shaken my entire sense of self. I needed help. I needed someone who could guide me through this darkness, someone who could help me make sense of everything that had happened and find a way to heal. It was at this point that I made the decision to see a therapist. I'll be honest with you. At first, I wasn't sure what to expect. I didn't know if talking to a stranger about my feelings would really make a difference. But I was desperate. I couldn't live in this emotional conflict any longer. I had to face my feelings head-on and start working through the mess I was in. The therapist helped me understand that what I was experiencing was completely normal, that what I was going through was more than just an emotional reaction to a family scandal. It was a trauma. My entire identity had been called into question, and I had been forced to confront something far deeper than a forbidden love. I had been betrayed by the people I trusted most, and it wasn't something I could just brush off. It was like a part of me had been ripped out, and I didn't know how to heal that wound. In those therapy sessions, I began to unpack the layers of my emotions. It wasn't easy. Every session felt like I was tearing open old wounds, exposing the rawness of my pain. But it was necessary. My therapist helped me realize that the trust issues I was facing weren't just about my husband. They were about trusting myself again. How had I not seen the truth? How had I ignored the warning signs, the subtle clues that something wasn't right? It wasn't about blaming myself. It was about understanding how this hidden truth had been kept from me and how I had allowed it to shape my reality. There were times when I felt like I was losing myself, like I couldn't find my way out of the emotional abyss I was in. But through the therapy and support from friends, I started to gain some clarity. Slowly, I began to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about learning how to live with the emotional conflict that it caused. I had to accept that I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the betrayal that had happened, nor could I erase the forbidden romance that had once seemed so perfect. But I could change how I responded to it. I could work on rebuilding myself, on finding a way to move forward, even if that meant letting go of the life I thought I had. I also sought support from my close friends. They were there for me in ways that my family couldn't be. They listened without judgment, offered advice when I asked for it, and simply held space for me to feel what I needed to feel. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I had people who truly cared for me and who would stand by me no matter what. Sometimes that's all you need. Someone to remind you that you're not alone in your struggle, that you're not broken just because your world feels like it's falling apart. But it wasn't just about talking. It was about action. I had to make decisions. Big decisions. And they weren't easy. Could I continue in my marriage? Could I ever rebuild trust with my husband? Or had the damage been too great? Could I stay in this relationship, knowing that it was built on a lie? Those were questions I had to ask myself, and they were the hardest questions I've ever faced. Therapy helped me understand that there wasn't a right answer. There was only what felt right for me. And I had to trust myself to make that choice, even if it meant walking away from everything I had known. Through reflection, I also came to realize that the family scandal wasn't just about my marriage. It was about my family, about what they had kept from me and how I needed to process that. I had been hurt by them too. Hurt by the fact that they had known about our connection and said nothing. But as I continued to work through my emotions, I realized that I couldn't carry that weight forever. I had to let go of the anger. I had to focus on healing, even if that meant taking a step back from my family and giving myself the space to process everything. It wasn't an overnight journey. Healing never is. Took time. But I started to feel stronger. Slowly, the fog started to lift. I started to remember who I was before all of this. The woman who was capable of love, who had dreams and aspirations, and who had the strength to move forward. The identity crisis that had gripped me was beginning to fade, and I could see a path forward, even if it wasn't the path I had originally envisioned. But healing wasn't about having all the answers. It was about accepting that I didn't need to have all the answers right away. It was about understanding that I was worthy of love, of trust, and of peace, even if my past didn't look the way I had hoped. I had to learn to let go of perfection and embrace the messiness of life. I had to learn that I could move forward, even in the face of something as devastating as this. At this point, I had gone through the worst emotional storm of my life. The betrayal, the family scandal, the emotional turmoil. It was all still fresh, still raw, but something inside me had shifted. I had spent so long trying to figure out what had happened, why it happened, and whether or not I could rebuild what had been broken. And now, finally, I was starting to come to terms with the fact that my future wasn't going to look like I had imagined it. It wasn't going to be easy, but I could choose how I moved forward, and that was the only thing that mattered. I realized that the most important decision I had to make was whether I wanted to stay in my marriage. Could I live with the hidden truth that had been revealed? Could I continue loving a man who, in my eyes, had betrayed me so deeply? Could I ever rebuild the trust that had been shattered between us? It wasn't just a simple decision. It was a complicated, emotional one that weighed heavily on my heart. The truth was, I loved him. That hadn't changed. But love alone couldn't fix what had been broken. Love couldn't undo the taboo nature of our relationship, the deception that had plagued our past. I had to ask myself if I could live with the knowledge that we were, in fact, cousins. Could I look at him and still see the man I had married? Or would I always see him as the person who had kept this monumental family secret from me? The journey to this decision wasn't quick. It wasn't even linear. Some days I felt like I was making progress, and other days I felt like I was back at square one. But I started to realize that my future didn't have to be defined by this shocking revelation. Yes, it had changed everything, but I didn't have to let it dictate every part of my life going forward. The truth had set me free in some ways. It had forced me to face the harsh reality of my situation, but it also opened the door for me to find a new path. I didn't have to stay stuck in the past. I could choose to move forward, even if it meant leaving behind parts of my life that no longer served me. I also realized that moving forward didn't necessarily mean moving on from my marriage. It meant figuring out if we could rebuild, if we could overcome the trust issues that had torn us apart. We had to address the emotional conflict head-on, together. It wasn't about sweeping things under the rug and pretending nothing had happened. It was about being brutally honest with each other, about confronting our feelings and making a choice. The choice to either rebuild or to walk away. But as I started looking at my future, I realized that the decision wasn't just about him. It was about me. It was about reclaiming my life, my identity, and my sense of self. It was about deciding what kind of woman I wanted to be moving forward. I didn't want to be defined by this family secret. I didn't want to let this forbidden romance define me. I wanted to live a life where I could be proud of the choices I made, regardless of how messy or complicated they were. And that's when I realized something important. Moving forward wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about pretending this never happened. It was about embracing the lessons I had learned. I had learned about the fragility of trust, the importance of honesty, and the power of self-love. I had learned that family bonds can be both beautiful and broken, and that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who can hurt you the most. But I had also learned that I was stronger than I thought. I had learned that I could survive the worst kind of emotional pain and still come out the other side, maybe a little bruised, but still whole. Now, as I look to the future, I feel a sense of peace. It's not a perfect peace, and it's not a peace that means I've completely forgiven the people who hurt me, but it's a peace that comes from acceptance. I've accepted that my life won't look like the fairy tale I once imagined. But I've also accepted that my story isn't over. I still have the power to shape it, to decide who I want to be and what I want my future to look like. And as for my marriage, I'm still figuring it out. I'm still deciding if we can rebuild, if we can move past the deception and find a way to love each other again. But no matter what happens, I know I've learned something valuable. That healing doesn't always mean going back to the way things were. Sometimes it means finding a new way to live, a new way to love, and a new way to be you. The future is uncertain, but that's okay. I'm learning to embrace it, to let go of the past, and to trust that whatever comes next will be what I need to grow. The emotional conflict may never fully go away, but I'm ready to face whatever comes, knowing that I have the strength to get through it. So here we are after everything I've shared. The emotions, the decisions, the betrayal and heartbreak, the family scandal. It all led me to this point. But here's the thing. You don't have to let a shocking revelation like this define you. Life is messy, complicated, and full of twists you never saw coming. The question is, how will you react when everything changes? Will you let your past control your future? Or will you find the strength to rebuild, to rise from the ashes, no matter what you've been through? If you've learned anything from my story, it's that you have the power to shape your future. The hardest part is facing the emotional conflict, the doubts, the confusion, and the pain head-on. But here's the truth. You're not alone in this journey. Whether you're dealing with trust issues, navigating a forbidden romance, or trying to rebuild after deception, the key is to take action. Healing starts with you, and it starts now. So, ask yourself, what are you holding on to that's preventing you from moving forward? What's keeping you from letting go of the past and stepping into a future that's truly yours? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, your own struggles. If this story resonates with you, if you're feeling stuck, don't let it sit there. Let's talk about it. And if you're ready to continue learning how to face the challenges life throws at you and build the life you deserve, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You've got this, and I'm here to help you navigate it.